Moser Jones, and I'm an assistant professor here in family science in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland. I started out actually as a journalist and then went into health journalism. So I consider myself someone who worked in public health in that way, and that I was a public health communicator, and then became interested in pursuing graduate work in public health and also in history. And I wanted to tell stories about how issues of health and social welfare unfolded in our country and around the world. My new book is The American Red Cross: From Clara Barton to the New Deal. Fairly straightforward title. It's about the history of the American Red Cross, and it really focuses on the beginning, the first 6 decades of its existence. But it does go up through the present. So why did I choose to write this book? Well, I was working as a journalist 5 blocks from the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. So I was, like hundreds of thousands of other people in that neighborhood, directly affected, and I experienced that tragic event up close. So when we were allowed to go back into the area, of course the National Guard was there. There were federal agents there with their jackets with the letters on the back. There were NYPD there. You know, there were all these places that were roped off, but who else was there? Well, the American Red Cross was there. And it seemed kind of odd to me because you had all of these sort of high security, expert, somewhat secretive agencies, organizations that you'd expect when you have a terrorist attack of that magnitude. And you have the people involved in public safety. And then you have this voluntary organization that was collecting socks for the rescue workers because they said people needed changes of socks. It just struck me as this odd sort of incongruity that the American Red Cross was not, was this volunteer organization, and how did it get this way? Like, why is it that the American Red Cross shows up? The American Red Cross is so familiar in our society. You know, we expect it to be there whenever there's a disaster, whenever there's a crisis, a tragedy. But at the same time, it's so unfamiliar because people don't even question why it's there. So I had this sort of question, why? And I went back, went to the library, being a, kind of a nerd myself. That's how I answer questions, go to the library, do research. And at the time I was in graduate school part-time, so I did a paper on it, and I found out that there weren't really any recent books on the Red Cross. The only books were ones that had been put out by the Red Cross, which were great for what they were, but they were promotional material. The last history of the American Red Cross was published in 1950, and while it told a very thorough story of the Red Cross up through World War II, it really didn't answer that why question that I had. Why is the Red Cross here? It talked about how it evolved, and at the same time it also didn't hold the Red Cross up to the standards that we would hold it up to, meaning it didn't ask those hard questions about, is the Red Cross really living up to its ideals, which originally were humanity and neutrality, and now have included impartiality and a couple of, there's 7 ideals now, but basically based around this idea of being neutral, politically neutral, and humanitarian. So I thought, someone needs to do this. So I started to do this. I started to look into the history of the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross, in its early years, was really chock full of really interesting characters. It was an organization of a few people, and then didn't become a large institution until really World War I. So the founder, of course, was Clara Barton. And she's kind of like the Red Cross itself in that she's at once so ubiquitous, so known as to be familiar, and at the same time, people don't really know what she did and who she really was. And she was this very much an outsider, not someone from, a really wealthy family. She had come to D.C. to be a patent clerk after working as a school teacher, and she really struggled with her own, self-confidence and with her moods and with being such an outsider. I mean, especially this era when women were supposed to not only be married and have children, but they weren't supposed to do things like run out into the battlefield or much less leave the home. In a lot of ways, she really did try to apply these ideals of neutrality and humanity to provide aid to people of all race, national origin, gender, and religious background. She really lived that. Then, at the end of the 19th century, things started to fall apart. This new woman came along, Mabel Boardman, who was a wealthy socialite from Washington, and had been involved in the Red Cross just in a very small way. But she became part of this faction that was trying to sort of get rid of Clara Barton and create a new American Red Cross that would be more efficient. It was really a culture war. These two characters represented different generations, different social classes, different whole approaches to humanitarianism and philanthropy. And so you have this clash between, Gilded Age wealth and sort of this New England thrifty 19th century character, and they just can't understand each other. But Boardman gets what she wants in that Barton resigns, and her whole cadre of followers and helpers also leave, and there's a whole new Red Cross that has to come into being that's basically composed of Boardman and prominent people, and they have to build a whole new organization. And the positive thing is they're suddenly able to raise a lot of money because Boardman knows all of these prominent people in business in New York and the Rockefellers, and so they're able to raise an endowment for the Red Cross. However, they lose all of that institutional knowledge that the Red Cross had with 20 years of disaster relief. And so they have to learn all over again how to help people in disasters. And they also lose, lastly, some of this idea of equitable relief that Barton really had. We're talking, this era was a horrible era for African American rights, and the American Red Cross reflected a lot of what would be the sort of mainstream views of white Americans who had the money to donate. The American Red Cross was in Tulsa during the 1921 race riot, which was actually, some people might call it a race war, where the whites went into the African American neighborhood and burned the whole thing down, the district of the city. There was fighting on both sides, but basically that's where it ended up. The local people were very mixed because some of the local people had done that. The white people had been doing that. The local black community was basically, since the district had been burned down, there were people coming from outside, and they were trying to work with people from outside, like the NAACP, people from churches, the Urban League. But the American Red Cross sent one worker in, and it was a case of, again, one person making a difference, where he said, no, we're going to help these people, and we're not going to do this in a shoddy way. We're going to be here, for the next 9 months. The Red Cross at this time was mainly a white organization. In fact, Paul Robeson's wife tried to apply during World War I to work for the Red Cross, as many white women did. And she, even though she was a chemist, she had a degree, a college degree, she was turned down. So the Red Cross itself at the local level, the local chapters, was reflective of the racism that was pervasive at this time in American society. However, there was this one guy from national headquarters who, for whatever reason, did not share those views, and he assembled a biracial coalition of workers, local people, to basically help the black community get back on its feet. Probably the most stark example of the time when neutrality became sort of a guise behind which sort of inequality was hiding and injustice was hiding was the 1927 flood, which is really the Katrina of the 20s. And during that flood, basically over 1 million people were displaced. The majority of them African American, the majority of them sharecroppers who were tenant farmers, often living in tremendous debt with barely enough money to feed their families, if that at all. The Mississippi flooded. It became this lake in places that was 50 miles wide. It was throughout the entire South. So you talk about Arkansas down to almost to New Orleans. The Red Cross had this system by now of having a national headquarters that supervised local chapters in different counties and different cities. So did the white planters look out for, the needs and respect the rights of the African American tenant farmers? No. Basically what happened was the people who were, the locals who were running relief operations would actually hold a lot of the flood sufferers, the black flood sufferers, on the levees, which were, right along the water, wet, basically in danger of always being overtopped or overflowed or drowned. They had state National Guard holding people at gunpoint. So we're not talking about just inequitable, but we're talking about sort of this undercurrent of threatened violence, of people being held by force against their will. So the National Red Cross supervised this sprawling, multi-state flood. And at the time, they would say, well, they were deferring to local custom. So neutrality with regard to local custom. We're not going to involve ourselves in the local politics. This is an existing issue. The people who ran the Red Cross were no proponents of the plantation system, but they also were not necessarily going to stick their neck out and defend, and try to change things there. And what happened is then when the National Red Cross came in and organized, erected more organized refugee camps. They were not only segregated by race, but the black refugee camps had inferior conditions. People, they were wet, they were cold, there was not adequate food. And again, this exposed an existing inequality. There were many fewer white flood sufferers. There were white sharecroppers, but so the camps were less crowded. A lot of whites had houses, and so that had multi-story, structures, and they could just go up to the second and third floors and live on these, and then, basically, the first floor was flooded. And a lot of the black flood sufferers lived in sharecroppers' cabins that the owner of the plantation provided that didn't even have screens, so they often had malaria because the mosquitoes came in, and they were, of course, totally flooded out. So Herbert Hoover who was Commerce Secretary then, and he was working with the Red Cross, said, okay, we're going to have an advisory committee of prominent African Americans that's going to go around and investigate. By the time this committee was able to do its work, A, the people running the camps were mainly, notified in advance, and B, it was months into the flood. So while there were incremental improvements made and their suggestions were taken in very specific cases, it was a little bit of a case of too little, too late. Now, This is not to say that this was just window dressing for, you know, sort of the Red Cross trying to check off a box. I think the people who were involved in this committee worked very hard to try to expose the conditions, along with, you know, people like Walter White of the NAACP, who went down there in disguise. He was very light-skinned, and he went down, you know, basically, you know, acting like he was a white guy from the North who wanted to just check it out, and he found out that indeed all the complaints were true, that people were being held against their will, and the planters said, well, you know, basically if we don't keep them here, they're just going to get a ride upriver, and we're not going to have our labor force anymore. So that's what they were afraid of. So this is a case in which the Red Cross, I think, was complicit in reinforcing this grossly inequitable system that was both socioeconomically and racially inequitable.